Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
NHS trusts are in a financial crisis. According to NHS providers, it seems to be the worst financial crisis in NHS history. 80% of acute hospitals now in deficit. There was a time in 2010 when the NHS was in surplus. What's happened?
Prime Minister.
Remind the right honourable gentleman that what has happened in relation to funding of the NHS is precisely this. We asked the NHS themselves to come up with their 5-year plan. We asked the NHS themselves to say what extra funding was needed to deliver on that. They came up with their 5-year plan, led by Simon Stevens as Chief Executive of the NHS. He said it was £8 billion that was needed. We're giving £10 billion of extra funding to the NHS.
On the front of The Guardian, in fact, there are two health stories in the papers. There's one on the Telegraph as well, from the same kind of source, I think it is. This is suggesting that Theresa May's claim on how much money is going into the NHS isn't right, and it's some MPs that are saying it.
Well, it's 5 MPs, and it's led by a top Conservative, Dr Sarah Wollaston, who's the chair of the Commons Health Select Committee. And these 5 MPs have written letters to the Chancellor saying you have to stop Theresa May saying she's giving the NHS £10 billion. This is incorrect. I mean, effectively, in not so many words, they're accusing her of lying. They're accusing the Prime Minister of telling a lie. Because she went in and said the other day that in an interview at the Manchester Evening News, she said, we were asked for £8 billion, we've given them £10 billion, so the NHS is fine, everything's dandy. And the MPs are saying, look, the only way you can come up with this £10 billion figure is if you completely disregard maths and actually how you get at these things, because there's £3.5 billion which has come from cuts. There are cuts to the social care budget and the DWP. There are cuts to community hospitals and nurses and other things which actually increase pressure on the NHS, which already has some pressure because of an ageing population. So £10 billion is just an imaginary figure.
But even the £6 billion, that includes those 3.5 billion cuts. But this is money.
So the £6 billion is what they're saying is actually going in.
Is actually going in, and even that only comes from you get the money in the NHS by cutting the other services, which actually then contribute to extra costs to the NHS. But the reality is that the NHS is in financial crisis, no question at all, and that's because we're getting older, silly us, and we're also getting fatter, silly us.
That's because the Tories keep ruining it.
You've got this idea that Tories are anti the NHS. I think that's absolutely
Tell me
nonsense.
how they are pro it. Look at the news.
No,
it doesn't
matter which government was in charge. They would still be having the same problem. And one of the things that lots of these NHS trusts are dealing with is the PFIs and these massive payments. They're paying sort of 10, 15 times more than the hospital's cost to build because Gordon Brown fiddled the figures, took it off the balance sheet.
Even worse.
Yeah, I know, but it's the idea that this is a Tory versus the NHS thing. When I speak to MPs, I do not get this vibe at all.
The NHS needs £30 billion. It needs £30 billion.
The NHS needs an awful lot of us to stop being fat.
It needs us to pay more into it as well.
Yeah,
we're not paying enough.
The reality is we don't pay anything like into it. Into our NHS, what the French, the Germans, the Latvians, and others pay.
OK, we need to take a break, but I mentioned the Telegraph so just to show that their line on it is that trusts are making cuts themselves.
Yeah, because they won't say that Theresa May's telling lies on the front page.
OK.
Sure, they'd be happy to.
This morning, MPs have written to the government refuting its claims that it is investing billions more in the NHS. Let's go live to Westminster now and talk to the chair of the Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston MP, who's part of this letter that's been written. It's creating headlines on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Hospital beds and A&E units face the axe. Quite a worrying headline that's come out of this letter. And Ms Wollaston, you want the Treasury to step in here and pump more money into the NHS?
That's right. In fact, what we're looking at is that 10 billion figure and making the point that you can only arrive at that if you add an extra year to health spending, if you're transferring money from other budgets that people would normally consider health, like public health and health education and training, and you change the date at which you calculate real terms increase in funding. And the reason it matters is that it gives an impression that the NHS is awash with cash, which clearly isn't the case, as highlighted by the other points on the in the Telegraph today. And it's not just health, it's social care. And what we're saying is that such a deep crisis in social care funding, that's having an impact on the NHS. So if there is extra money this autumn, there's a growing consensus that should be prioritised to social care, because we can't keep seeing health and social care in isolation. They do have it does have a huge impact on the NHS in terms of people not being able to get out of hospital or being admitted unnecessarily if we haven't got the social care there in place to support them.
Well, the NHS is currently receiving more funding than ever, and the government will say, well, hang on a minute, we're spending £10 billion on the NHS over the next 5 years. Are you saying that that's a lie?
Now, what I'm saying is that you can see how they've arrived at that figure, but the way that has been arrived at is by moving money around the system and taking money away from other critical parts of the health system. So yes, it's technically correct. If you add an extra year to the spending review period, you go back to 2014 instead of starting from 2015. And as I say, if you actually discount the fact that you've arrived there by moving money out of other critical budgets that people would normally think of as being health spending. And that then has an impact in the future sustainability of the NHS. If the money isn't there, for example, to do the prevention work or the capital budgets, for example, that we need to transform services, or, for example, money there to actually provide education and training for staff across health and social care. So it is a worrying situation, and particularly in the next couple of years for the health service, we're going to see in the year 2018-19 a real terms cut per capita in the funding of the NHS. So these are worrying times for NHS funding, and we're calling on the government to actually look at that and actually increase the funding across the whole of health and social care.
So for you, the devil is in the detail, but you do have to ask the question, is throwing more money at the NHS the answer? I mean, does it not need a complete overhaul? The NHS has been run the same way since the 1940s, and what the government is doing is trying to get the NHS to run more like a business, be responsible for its money, take its budget and use it properly where it's needed. And that's why they're asking them to have what they're calling service improvements.
Yes, and indeed that is taking place, but very many of those transformation changes require upfront funding to make those changes. And those are just the budgets that are being raided now in the third year, very seriously raided. So if you can't get those projects up and running, it makes it much more difficult to make the NHS sustainable in the future. And we've been hearing on your programme today about the impact of childhood obesity. Again, if you actually don't put in place the measures that are going to be necessary to actually reduce demand in the future and narrow the gap between the richest and the poorest children, then I'm afraid you're going to be in trouble in the NHS, and you're not going to deliver on those crucial aims that Theresa May set out on the steps of Downing Street, that she was going to tackle the burning injustice of health inequality. That does require investment in prevention, and transformative change across the NHS requires capital investment to get that up and running.
OK, Dr Sarah Wollaston, MP, thank you very much for talking to us about that issue here on Sunrise this morning. Thank you.